Hello, I'm Dr. Greg Parsons. In this presentation we'll deal with the DBA dissertation, both the process as well as the results. This will be consistent with the prospectus template that we're currently using as well as the upcoming DBA handbook. For ease of reference, I call this the TSLG model, or two-stream literature gap model, and this will be fairly apparent as we proceed. As I've mentioned in other places, the approach that we use in the DBA program at Kaiser is the 5-chapter dissertation. And although other universities may use a 6-chapter or a 7-chapter, the basic idea is the same. The structure covers primarily the same set of issues, which is the introduction, the literature review, and here we'll be using at least 2 streams of literature, the methodology that will be employed, the results, and then finally the conclusions. Summary of findings. So this is pretty standard throughout PhD and DBA dissertations. That's the result. Now the question is, how do you get there? So the TSLG model attempts to put it all together and show the process that you have to go through. And we start with the streams of literature, and a stream of literature is taken from a body of literature, and you will normally use your area of concentration. So if you're a marketing student going into the marketing concentration, you'll be choosing your stream of literature from marketing literature. If you're in leadership, you'll be choosing your literature from the leadership field. And it's obvious that you will know more about that particular field after taking 6 classes in it and being exposed to the literature in that field than you will anything else. So it only makes sense that that would be your choice of literature to work from. But also you'll need a second stream of literature, and this may come from within the same field. For example, 2 streams of marketing literature coming from different theories. This may come from 2 streams of leadership literature coming from different theories. Or it may come from a different field. So, for example, sometimes you'll see dissertations on leadership that combine it with psychology, or marketing dissertations that combine it with marketing with another field. Okay, so we need a second stream of literature, and the question is why? Well, that's because we're not really trying to invent anything new, except by combining 2 things together to come up with a new recipe or a new approach. So out of the bodies of literature, the theories, you're going to take a stream of literature which takes the information and starts to boil it down. Okay? So you start fairly general and then get more and more specific until the 2 streams of literature become fairly closely identified. The terms are well defined. The theories are very specific about what you're talking about. And from that point, there's a gap defined, the gap between the 2 streams of literature, and then a bridge that crosses that gap. This whole process is called the prospectus stage. Okay? And until you pass the prospectus stage and turn in a completed prospectus, you can't really advance any further. So you're going to need 2 well-defined, very narrowly focused streams of literature. You're going to have a tightly defined gap and a bridge. It may not be totally done, but this is required to show that you are now in a situation that you know what you're doing and you know the direction you're going. And at that point, you'll get a panel or a committee assigned to the dissertation. Now you move on to the proposal development, which is the first 3 chapters. And at this point now you need to start thinking more about the research questions and the hypotheses that will be used to prove that the gap and the bridge that you've been proposed can actually hold the weight of the idea and can be proven or disproven to be true or false. This will include development of hypotheses which can be statistically tested, and also how the data will be collected, which particular instruments might be used, where the data will be collected from. And this leads to the completion of the proposal, at which point student has to do a proposal defense, which is a presentation, either in person or online, in front of the faculty and the administration and whichever students would wish to participate or witness this. Once the proposal defense has been successfully completed, All right. Then the Institutional Review Board will look at the data collection method that has been proposed and either approve it or disprove it, but that has to be gained first. That if you're dealing with human subjects, you have to have the approval to move on. After which you can start to collect the data and begin the analysis of the data. When that's complete, then the report the findings, the statistical findings, what the t-tests and the different statistical analysis say, and then finally to convert that into English and talk about what the results actually were, what they meant, how they helped the theory, how they advanced the theories, and how they might be of use to practicing managers. At that point, then, a final defense is scheduled, and the entire dissertation, all 5 chapters, will be presented and defended to an audience of administration, faculty, and students again. So this is the process, and these are the different stages that you have to go through. Now, the idea of producing the gap is the thing that confuses people most of all. But there's a great example. Michael Porter, who was one of the premier authors in the field of strategic management, was doing his dissertation at Harvard, and he was taking classes in both the business school as well as the economic school. They're on opposite sides of the Charles River, and it's talked about this side of the river or that side of the river. But the point is he was being exposed to 2 different bodies of literature, one from business policy and one from industrial organization economics. From that perspective, he saw that both of these areas, both of these fields, were trying to reach the same goal. But they weren't talking to each other. They weren't using the same terminology. People that were working in economics weren't studying business. People in business weren't studying economics. And consequently, because of that perspective he had, he could synthesize the streams and define the gap, which ultimately led to the bridge, which became the 5 forces theory and the generic strategies theory and the hundreds and hundreds of articles and books that Porter has authored over the past 30 years. So, out of the same basic idea, great things can happen, and that's what our students working on their dissertation will look for. Not that we expect everybody to become a Michael Porter in their field, but the idea of bringing 2 different ideas together, synthesizing them, and creating the gap and the bridge is a universally accepted way to do a dissertation. Maybe an example would help. So I'm working currently with a student that is looking at trait-based leadership theory as one body of literature, and organizational change theory as a second body of literature, and out of those will be developed literature streams, which will synthesize the literatures down to a very narrow focus, and then will produce a gap and a bridge, and described as organizational change theory can be advanced with leadership trait theory by combining them together. Now this will have to be, of course, much more clearly defined with terms and literature, but this is the basic idea of the synthesis. So that's the gap and the bridge. Since that's been accomplished, now we're ready to move on to the next stage, which is to define the research questions and the hypotheses and how the data might be collected to prove those. So the research question in general might be, are certain leadership traits more important to the success of organizational change? And of course this might be will be made more specific and have very specific statistically testable hypotheses associated with it, but this is the general idea of moving now into the research questions and how the data is going to be collected, which variables are going to be measured, which instruments are going to be used. And at that point, of course, once that's finished, you've got the first 3 chapters and you do the proposal defense. We get approval from the IRB. We start sending out surveys and making other observations that are going to be the source of the data. When that's finished, we're going to analyze it, run it through statistical packages, compare it to hypotheses, and ultimately summarize the results and conclusions. So this is how the process works. for a student in leadership. And the same thing would be true in international business, or the same thing would be true in marketing. So I've worked with students on this for quite a while, and I've got quite a few observations, but I'll boil them down into a couple of minor ones. First of all, you got to study the literature in your field. So if you're going into leadership, you've got to become an expert in the leadership field. There are thousands of articles, hundreds of thousands, millions of articles written about leadership. There are hundreds of theories of leadership. Well, you have to become fairly familiar with who are the major theorists, what are the major developments in the field, and when you choose something to work on, that's going to be the basis of your stream of literature. You have to begin to understand how gaps are created, how you identify them, how you identify variables that are going to be measured. You have to become familiar with the data collection instruments that are commonly used in the field, and then also the analytical techniques that are used. Most of the articles you'll be reading will also identify areas for further research, which might be an area that you would want to work in. Okay, so first of all, become very familiar with the literature. Then, as you become more familiar and you start looking for potential gaps, realize that your dissertation topic will have to be based on existing theory. Okay, that's where the streams of literature come from. It's got to be very narrow and focused, using very broad topics such as organizational change. Well, yeah, that's a area, but there are many theories of organizational change. There are many ways that organizations can change. So you've got to, again, narrow it down, focus it on something you can actually work with. What you end up with needs to be unique. In other words, you're not doing something that somebody else has already done, but it also has to be generalizable, in that it can be applied to other areas, that it's adding value to the theories and the field that you're working in. And finally, through this entire process, there's got to be some sense of, if you move ahead, where are you going to collect the data that you need? How are you going to do it? Are you going to use the internet to do online surveys? Or you have an organization that you can observe things going on? What exactly are you going to use for data? And so it's kind of disappointing when we work through the entire process and find out that there's no data available to deal with the research questions that are being proposed. Okay. So these are the two main things. The whole point of this presentation has been to kind of give people an idea of the process that they have to go through, what to look forward to, and how to start preparing for it. Because as you're taking your concentration classes, those all provide an opportunity for a secondary stream of literature. It might come from economics, it might come from finance, it might come from accounting, it might come from almost anywhere. So there are many different sources of secondary streams of literature that are available. So that's about it. I'm sure this should stimulate some questions, so get in touch with me if you would like to add to this conversation or would like to ask some more questions about it. Until then, goodbye and good luck.